Every disappearance is a story with its last chapter ripped away. For the families, the torment isn't just loss, it's the silence, the endless question of what happened. In the annals of true crime and history, we often hear about unsolved vanishings, cases that remain cold, mysteries that never yield their secrets. But there is another category of disappearance. Those that eventually do come back with an answer. To support this channel, kindly like and hit the subscribe button for more thrilling content. Some are solved through the recovery of a body, a confession, or even modern DNA breakthroughs. Others are clarified only by the relentless work of investigators, soldiers, or even chance discoveries in the wilderness. Tonight, we explore 5 haunting cases of people who vanished, under strange, terrifying, or uncertain circumstances. Their fates remained clouded for years, even decades. But in the end, their stories were resolved, some in tragedy, one in reunion, and others in the cold calculus of organized crime or the chaos of war. 5 disappearances. 5 endings. Each unique. Each unforgettable. Our journey begins in 1950, in colonial Hong Kong, where an Oxford-trained scholar stepped out into the bustling port city and never came home. The scholar on Lantau, J.K. Ridout. John Kennedy Ridout was not a spy, not a soldier, not a criminal. He was, by all accounts, a scholar. Born in Britain in 1912, Ridout pursued the life of the mind. He studied the classics at Oxford, and quickly distinguished himself in the study of languages. His career path led him into Oriental studies, what we would today call East Asian studies, an academic field that, at the time, was in high demand as the West tried to understand a rapidly changing Asia. By his late 30s, Ridout was already respected among his peers. He had held teaching positions at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and later at the University of Sydney. Eventually, he took a post in Hong Kong, a cosmopolitan British colony and a vital hub for trade, diplomacy, and intelligence at the dawn of the Cold War. On February 16, 1950, Ridout disappeared. He had been seen around the university earlier that day, his movements ordinary, his demeanor calm. And then, nothing. When he failed to return home, colleagues and friends grew alarmed. Hong Kong was not a quiet place at this time. The Chinese Civil War had only recently ended with a communist victory. Refugees flooded into the colony. Espionage was rampant. Against this backdrop, the sudden disappearance of a British academic raised unsettling questions. Had he defected? Been kidnapped? Killed? For 12 long days, there were no answers. Rumors began to swirl in the press. Some claimed Ridout had been seen boarding a ferry, others that he had been spotted near the docks. Whispered theories linked him to espionage, suggesting perhaps he had crossed into mainland China or had been silenced by shadowy agents. But then, on the 12th day, the South China Sea gave up its secret. A fisherman discovered a body washed ashore on Lantau Island, Hong Kong's rugged and sparsely populated outpost. It was Ridout. He was identified quickly, his body battered by the waves but intact enough to confirm. The colonial authorities held an inquest. The findings were straightforward, almost mundane: accidental drowning. Perhaps he slipped, perhaps he misjudged the currents. There was no sign of foul play, no evidence of murder. And yet, not everyone was convinced. In a city riddled with spies, defections, and disappearances, Ridout's death seemed too convenient, too mysterious. Some of his colleagues whispered of double lives and secret work. The rumors lingered, echoing through universities and diplomatic circles for years. But in the end, history recorded Ridout's disappearance as an accident. A scholar lost not to espionage, but to the unforgiving sea. His case was, in the technical sense, solved. His body returned. His fate clarified. But like many solved disappearances, it left behind an unsettling truth. Sometimes, the official explanation feels smaller than the myth people build in its absence. The ocean had spoken. But the whispers of Hong Kong's Cold War shadows ensured that the mystery of J.K. Ridout would never fully rest. The boy who came back as a grandfather, Luis Albino. Summer of 1951. Oakland, California. 6-year-old Luis Albino was a playful, curious boy, just like so many children in his working-class neighborhood. He had a small frame, bright eyes, and the boundless energy of a child who loved nothing more than running around the park near his home. On an ordinary afternoon, his mother, Carmen, allowed him to play as she did countless times before. But when the sun began to dip, and other children returned home, Luis did not. Minutes stretched into hours, and a mother's intuition, sharp as a blade, screamed that something was wrong. Luis Albino had vanished. The search began immediately. Police scoured the park, canvassed neighborhoods, and questioned everyone who might have seen the boy. Posters went up. Newspapers carried his face. For Carmen Albino, each night became a waking nightmare, her son's bed empty, his toys untouched, his laughter gone. Detectives theorized abduction. Stranger kidnappings were rare, but not impossible. There was no ransom note, no demands, no evidence left behind. It was as if Luis had been plucked off the face of the earth. Days became weeks. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. The Albino case went cold, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. For Carmen, hope was both a blessing and a curse. She told neighbors she could still feel Luis somewhere out there, alive, growing older without her. But as years rolled into decades, even hope seemed to dim. Carmen passed away never knowing what had become of her son. But Luis's story didn't end in the 1950s. It simply went underground, buried in silence, waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist. Fast forward to the 21st century. DNA testing had transformed the field of genealogy, allowing millions to trace family trees, discover long-lost relatives, and connect across continents. Among the countless swabs sent to labs was one belonging to a man who had lived his entire life under another name. He was a retired firefighter, a Vietnam veteran, a grandfather living quietly on the East Coast. For decades, he believed his childhood began in New York, where he'd been raised by a family that loved him but had never shared the full story of where he came from. When his DNA results came back, the algorithm matched him with relatives he didn't know, relatives in California. One name stood out: Albino. It was almost unthinkable, but the pieces began to align. Through DNA, genealogists confirmed the impossible truth. He was Luis Albino. The boy who vanished from an Oakland park in 1951 had lived an entire life under a different identity. Somewhere, somehow, he had been taken from California to New York and raised as someone else's son. Whether his disappearance was the result of an abduction, an illegal adoption, or a desperate act of someone trying to claim a child for their own, remains unclear. What mattered was that Luis had survived. For over 70 years, his family had mourned him as lost. And then, in a twist that seems more like fiction than reality, he was found, not as a boy, but as a grandfather. In 2024, Luis traveled to California to meet his younger brother, who was in poor health. Their reunion was bittersweet. They laughed, they cried, they tried to make up for 70 years in a handful of days. Just weeks later, Luis's brother passed away. For Luis, it was a moment of joy tempered by loss. He had finally reconnected with his blood, but time, relentless and unforgiving, had stolen much of what could have been. Still, his very existence was a miracle, a living missing person case solved not with a body, but with a life rediscovered. The case of Luis Albino challenges everything we assume about missing persons. Too often, we expect closure to mean tragedy. But here was proof that sometimes, a vanished child can grow into an adult who serves his country, saves lives, builds a family, and becomes a pillar of his community, all while carrying a mystery inside him he never knew existed. For his family, the truth was painful but healing. The silence was finally broken. The boy was home. In the end, Luis Albino's story was solved by science. A child lost in the 1950s re-emerged in the 2020s. A cold case cracked not by detectives, but by DNA. And for every family still searching, his story offers one thing above all: hope. Red Feeblecorn, America's missing ace. Some men are born into legend. Ernest Charles "Red" Feeblecorn was one of them. Born in Michigan in 1922, Feeblecorn grew up in the Great Depression. Like many young men of his generation, he looked skyward when the Second World War broke out. He joined the United States Army Air Forces and quickly proved himself not just capable, but extraordinary. Flying the P-51 Mustang, the sleek and deadly fighter that helped turn the tide of the air war, Feeblecorn racked up victory after victory. By the war's end, he was a bona fide ace, credited with 9 confirmed aerial kills. He was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Air Medal. He was young, daring, and fearless, an American hero in the sky. When the guns fell silent in 1945, many fighter aces retired to quieter lives. But not Feeblecorn. For him, flying wasn't just duty, it was identity. He remained in the Air Force, building his career in peacetime, never knowing how soon he would be called to war again. 5 years later, in 1950, the Korean Peninsula erupted. North Korean troops surged south, igniting the Korean War. Once again, America turned to its pilots, and once again, Ernest "Red" Feeblecorn answered the call. By July 1950, just weeks into the conflict, Feeblecorn was assigned to fly the F-82 Twin Mustang, a twin-fuselage long-range fighter. The F-82 was a relic of the late World War II era, designed for range rather than agility. For men like Feeblecorn, it was not the sleek P-51 they once knew, but it was the weapon they had. On July 6, 1950, Feeblecorn and his radar operator, Lieutenant Samuel Adams, were tasked with a dangerous mission, a low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack flight north of Seoul. It was risky work. Flying low made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, but the intelligence they gathered was crucial. They took off into a sky heavy with summer haze, streaked with smoke from burning villages below. Hours passed. Then radio contact faded. The mission log noted their last known position, but after that, silence. When their F-82 failed to return, alarms went up. Search and rescue teams scoured the area, but the chaos of the early war made systematic searching nearly impossible. Villages were being abandoned, roads were choked with refugees, front lines shifted daily. 4 weeks, there was no word. The Air Force officially listed Feeblecorn and Adams as missing in action. For his family back home in Michigan, those words were both a lifeline and a torment. Missing was not the same as dead. Missing meant maybe, just maybe, he was alive, held prisoner, waiting to be rescued. The Feeblecorn family clung to hope. They told themselves that Red was resourceful, that he might have evaded capture, that one day the war would end and he'd come walking through the door. But the war dragged on, and the years dragged with it. 3 long years later, in 1953, the Korean War ended with an armistice. In the aftermath, United Nations troops pushed into areas that had been fiercely contested. It was during one of these sweeps that they found the wreckage. The twisted remains of an F-82 lay north of Seoul, half buried in brush and earth. Inside, the skeletal remains of 2 men. Dog tags confirmed what the Air Force had feared but not said aloud. Major Ernest C. "Red" Feeblecorn and Lieutenant Samuel Adams had been killed in action on July 6, 1950. Their mission had ended in fire and metal, not captivity. The remains were recovered, and Feeblecorn was finally laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. A hero's grave for a hero's life. For his family, the word missing was replaced with certainty. The wait was over. The truth, though heartbreaking, was finally known. Feeblecorn's legacy endures. In the annals of military aviation, his name is etched alongside other aces who pushed themselves to the limits of courage and skill. But his disappearance also stands as a reminder of the cost of war, not just in lives, but in the cruel limbo of uncertainty that families endure when a loved one vanishes in combat. In the end, Ernest "Red" Feeblecorn did not simply vanish. He fought, he flew, and he fell. The war erased him from the skies, but it could not erase his story. His disappearance was solved not by confession or coincidence, but by recovery. A wreck, a set of dog tags, and the final honor of burial. Closure may not bring joy, but it brings truth. And truth matters. The maple leaf that never landed. Bill Barilko. Some disappearances become folklore. They fuse with myth, with sport, with national memory, until the story is as much legend as history. For Canadians, the name Bill Barilko holds such a place. To hockey fans, he is remembered not just as a player, but as a ghost, forever tied to one of the greatest goals in the history of the game. Bill Barilko was born in 1927 in Timmins, Ontario, a mining town carved out of the frozen north. Like many Canadian boys, he learned to skate on outdoor rinks, his breath clouding in the winter air. By 1947, At just 20 years old, he was called up to the NHL to play defense for the Toronto Maple Leafs. In those days, the Leafs were a dynasty. And Barilko was a perfect fit, tough, fearless, willing to throw his body into the boards without hesitation. He wasn't the most graceful skater, nor the flashiest scorer, but he had grit. Fans loved him for it. In the spring of 1951, the Leafs faced off against the Montreal Canadiens in the Stanley Cup Finals. The series was electric. Each of the first 4 games went into overtime. The tension in Game 5 was unbearable. Then, in the first overtime period, with the score tied 2-2, Bill Barilko took a pass from teammate Cal Gardner. He skated into the slot and fired a backhand shot past Montreal goaltender Jerry McNeil. The puck hit the net. The crowd erupted. It was the cup-winning goal. A moment frozen in time. Barilko's teammates mobbed him on the ice as fans roared in Maple Leaf Gardens. The Leafs had won, and Barilko was the hero. But destiny is cruel. That legendary goal would be the last he ever scored. Just 4 months later, in August 1951, Barilko joined his friend and dentist, Henry Hudson, for a fishing trip deep in northern Ontario. The two men boarded a small float plane, a Fairchild 24, and took off into the endless boreal wilderness. They never came back. When the plane failed to return, searches were launched. For weeks, pilots combed the north. But the terrain was unforgiving, millions of acres of trees, swamps, and lakes. The plane was too small, the wilderness too vast. The search was eventually called off. Barilko was gone. His disappearance shocked the nation. How could the golden boy of Canadian hockey vanish without a trace? Fans, teammates, and family were left with nothing but questions and grief. The Maple Leafs, haunted by the loss, went into a championship drought. Year after year, they fell short. It seemed almost as if they were cursed. For 11 years, the mystery lingered. The wilderness kept it secret. Then, in 1962, a helicopter flying over the remote bush spotted something unusual. A wreckage twisted in the muskeg, a broken plane swallowed by the forest floor. Investigators moved in. Inside the wreck, they found human remains. It was Bill Barilko and Henry Hudson. The plane had crashed shortly after takeoff, their bodies entombed in the wilderness for over a decade. The same year the wreck was found, the Maple Leafs broke their drought. In an eerie twist of fate, the curse seemed lifted. They won the Stanley Cup again, for the first time since Barilko's legendary goal. It was as if his spirit had been holding the team back, waiting to be found, before finally letting them win again. Bill Barilko's story has become more than hockey history, it's Canadian folklore. Immortalized in songs, documentaries, and the memories of fans who never even saw him play. His disappearance was solved the way many are, through discovery, through the cold fact of wreckage and remains. But what makes Barilko's case different is how it transcended tragedy. His final goal, his sudden vanishing, and his eventual rediscovery became stitched into the fabric of a nation's sport. He is not remembered for how he died, but for how he lived, and for the shot that won the cup, the goal that has never stopped echoing through time. In the end, Bill Barilko never made it back from that fishing trip. But in every sense that matters, he never truly left. Blood in Jamaica Bay. Philip Mangano. Not all disappearances are mysteries of chance. Some are warnings. Messages written in violence, carved into the streets of organized crime. April 19, 1951. Brooklyn, New York. The Mangano crime family was one of the 5 families that dominated the American Mafia in New York City. At its head was Vincent Mangano, the boss. At his side, his brother, Philip Mangano, the consigliere. Together, they held sway over Brooklyn's docks and rackets. But in the world of Cosa Nostra, power is never secure. Rivalries fester. Ambitions burn. And one man was waiting for his moment. Albert Anastasia. Known as the Mad Hatter, he was feared across the underworld. A ruthless killer, co-founder of the infamous Murder Incorporated, and underboss to Vincent Mangano. 4 years, tension simmered between Anastasia and the Mangano brothers. Vincent distrusted him. Philip resented him. But Anastasia was too powerful to sideline, too dangerous to confront directly. On that April morning, the conflict reached its breaking point. Philip Mangano left his home in Brooklyn as usual. But he would not return. Hours later, his body was discovered face down in a marsh near Jamaica Bay, riddled with bullets. He had been shot multiple times in the back and neck, executed in classic mob style. That same day, Vincent Mangano disappeared. His body was never found. Two brothers, two power players, erased within hours. The killings sent shockwaves through New York. The FBI and police knew exactly what had happened. Albert Anastasia had staged a violent coup. By eliminating the Mangano brothers, he assumed control of the family, rebranding it under his own ruthless leadership. But in the world of organized crime, proof was a different matter. No witnesses. No confessions. No one willing to stand against Anastasia. The case was solved in the sense that everyone knew who had ordered the killings, but it would never be solved in a courtroom. For Philip Mangano's family, there was no mystery. The body in the marsh told the story. The disappearance had an ending, violent, bloody, final. But for law enforcement, it was another reminder of the mafia's iron grip over silence. In Cosa Nostra, loyalty is enforced by fear, and fear silences witnesses. Anastasia rose to power, untouchable, his hands red with the blood of the Mangano brothers. The disappearance of Philip Mangano was not an unsolved riddle. It was a brutal message. In the mafia, men vanish when power changes hands. And when their bodies surface, the message is clear: this is what happens to those who stand in the way. His murder was a solved disappearance, but like many solved cases, the solution did not bring justice. Only inevitability. These cases remind us of a sobering truth: a disappearance does not always mean forever. Sometimes, the missing are found. Sometimes, the silence is broken. But closure is not the same as peace. A body can be found, a confession given, a wreck discovered, a truth revealed, and yet the wound remains. For families, solved does not erase the pain. It only replaces uncertainty with reality. And in rare cases, like Luis Albino, the ending is not tragic, but miraculous. A missing child returns as a grandfather. Proof that sometimes, hope survives the longest silence. Because behind every missing persons case, solved or unsolved, there is a family waiting for truth. And truth, at the very least, is what they deserve.